The first generation Chrysler minivans that were introduced in 1984 were arguably the vans that saved Chrysler Corporation along with the K-Car platform. The K-Car basically produced so many different Chrysler vehicles in the early to mid 1980s that one automotive journalist, David E. Davis, once proclaimed that it seems like Chrysler had their finger stuck on the K key during this time period. But I really do have to commend Chrysler Corporation for coming out with a minivan at a time when other companies like GM and Ford really didn't want to, despite the fact that their internal teams had a number of proposals that were effectively minivans. General Motors had already thought up and designed a prototype for a body-based or Chevrolet Celebrity, Pontiac 6000, Olds Cutlass Sierra, Buick Century-based minivan, but declined to produce it or put it into production, instead opting to go with the so-called dustbuster vans many years after Chrysler introduced their minivans in 1984. Ford also had a so-called Minimax minivan that they were looking to put in production all the way back in the late 1970s, but the idea was scrapped as Ford management thought that it might impinge on profitable station wagon sales. Of course, GM and Ford would come out with minivans like the Astro and the Aerostar, which were rear-wheel drive and based on their small truck platforms, but it would take them many years before they would come out with front-wheel drive-based minivans. And that really was the beauty of these Chrysler minivans, was that the front-wheel drive enabled a flat floor and also a low load height. And these really were minivans in the truest sense of the term. More specifically, the short wheelbase Chrysler minivans, like the Dodge Caravans you see here, had an overall length of 175 inches. Now, what does that mean and how can I contextualize that? Well, a modern Toyota Corolla is about 182 inches long. So these minivans were 6-7 inches shorter than a modern-day Toyota Corolla and almost 20 inches shorter than a modern-day Chevrolet Malibu. In other words, they are tiny. And yet, despite being tiny, even the short wheelbase minivans had plenty of space on the inside. They came standard with 2-row seating, but you could get optional 3-row seating that provided seating for up to 7 people. You could get 2 people in the front in the captain's seats. Then the middle bench seat was a 2-person bench seat, enabling you to kind of pass through when the door was open to the rear bench, which would allow you to have 3 people in that rear bench seat. There were also a ton of configurations that you could have on your minivan. More specifically, you could take out the middle bench seat and you could move up that 3-person bench seat to that middle position. There was another set of anchors that were disguised by little plastic caps in the floor that enabled you to do that. And when that rearmost bench was in its position, you could slide it forward about 6 inches, or you could slide it all the way up to the second bench seat, making it effectively unusable, but giving you more cargo space in the rear. Now, the one drag about these was that in order to remove those bench seats, it was often a 2-person job, and that was one of the things that GM really tried to capitalize on when they introduced the dustbuster vans, because the dustbuster vans had individual seats that you could remove one by one and enable you to configure the van however you wanted. In any case, the Chrysler products just proved so tremendously successful. And as I said, Chrysler had so many variants of these. The short wheelbase version, the long wheelbase version, the Plymouth Voyager, the Dodge Caravan. They had cargo versions like the Dodge Mini Ram, I believe it was called. And then, of course, you'd have the Chrysler Town & Country, kind of the up-level version. Eventually, some of these would get all-wheel drive. I mean, Chrysler just had a proliferate amount of these minivans in different combinations, and they sold extremely well until, unfortunately, they kind of got this reputation for being soccer mom vehicles that put the nail in the coffin. But they were highly space efficient, comfortable, and like I said, they could seat many people, up to 7 people, in a very, very compact package. Now, what did Chrysler have as the motivating force behind these minivans? Well, for the first 3 years of their life, from 1984 through partway through the 1987 model year, there were 2 powertrains that were available, or I should say 2 engines, as well as 2 transmissions. On the transmission side of the house, there was the Chrysler TorqueFlite 3-speed as well as a 5-speed manual transmission. And then under hood, there was a standard carbureted 2.2-liter four-cylinder that made around 90 horsepower, and then a optional 2.6-liter Mitsubishi-sourced four-cylinder engine that made a little over 100 horsepower. So nothing really exciting, both carbureted variants. The minivan never got the 2.2-liter fuel-injected engine, despite it being optional in other Chrysler products. Not quite sure why, but that was the case. Then partway through the 1987 model year, the standard engine became a fuel-injected 2.5-liter four-cylinder, a much better affair for many minivan customers. And there was an optional 3-liter V6 engine that was Mitsubishi-sourced yet again. So this provided more motivating force for your Chrysler minivan. And in point of fact, that 2.5-liter fuel-injected four-cylinder made 100 horsepower. That was more than, it was actually 96 horsepower was what the carbureted 2.2-liter four-cylinder made. And then the Mitsubishi-sourced V6 was pretty decent in the horsepower rating department. And it made 136 horsepower upon its introduction. But what was the special engine that you could get in these Chrysler minivans? Well, beginning in the 1989 model year, you could get a turbocharged 2.5-liter fuel-injected four-cylinder engine that made 150 horsepower. In the same year, the Mitsubishi 3-liter V6 was revised and could produce 142 horsepower. So the four-cylinder was actually the most powerful variant. And that is what you see here in these pictures, is a 1989 Dodge Caravan with the turbocharged 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine that, again, made 150 horsepower. Now, how do we know that this is a turbo Chrysler minivan? Well, it says turbo on the front fender, as you can see here. I don't know what I think about the styling of these first-generation minivans. I think for the time they were considered, well, not necessarily attractive, but also not offensive either. They kind of look like a bread box to my eye, very slab-sided on the sides. Of course, Chrysler was trying to have a large amount of interior space, and so the best way to get a lot of interior space is to have flat sides, because then you have a lot of shoulder room and room in the interior, as opposed to vehicles that have more tumble home or where the sides kind of curve in toward the top of the roof. This clearly does not have that. But the best part about this van is really what's on the inside. Let's take a look here at the driver's seat. And there you go. Take a look at that. 3 pedals. And you can kind of catch the shifter for the 5-speed transmission there between the 2 captain's chairs. It's relatively short, but a 3-pedal minivan. How cool is that? And not only is it 3 pedals with a turbocharged engine under hood, you're also sitting and driving your Dodge Caravan Turbo in, well, comfort. Look at those captain's chairs. Very comfortable cloth, armrests on both sides. The seating position in these is actually pretty good. You do sit up quite high. And overall, the minivans are pretty comfortable. Now, these are based on the K-Car platform, so I wouldn't call them the best riders, or they don't really have the best ride, but it's not an offensive ride. And certainly if you were trying to haul a bunch of family members around, they were convenient and they were very space efficient. I also do enjoy the sporty 3-spoke wheel there that has little notches for your thumbs at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. And of course, you have to have the obligatory faux wood grain dash. Now, by this point, Chrysler was doing away with the electronic voice alert, those things in the car that would say, or the computer module that would say, your door is ajar. No, it's not a jar, it's a door. And they went to these handsome and attractive round dials and full instrumentation. Here, obviously, the owner has added a turbo gauge. I think that's pretty awesome. You can kind of tell when the turbo is kicking in just based on the acceleration and the sound, but I guess he or she just wanted to be able to monitor it more closely. And I do love that the instrument panel here says front drive. Ooh, I guess they were very proud of the fact that these were front-wheel drive minivans. And here's the heart of this minivan, the 2.5-liter fuel-injected single overhead cam 4-cylinder engine. Now, I will say in naturally aspirated form, these 2.5-liter engines were actually pretty reliable, especially the fuel-injected versions. They weren't bad overall. Some of them did have head gasket issues. However, as you can imagine, when the turbocharger was slapped on them, they even had more head gasket issues. So that's one thing to be careful of in your turbocharged minivan is I will say that these did have a fair amount of head gasket issues, as was true for many turbocharged engines of the time, particularly 4 cylinders. But, like I said, in naturally aspirated form, if you were to find a minivan with a 2.5-liter fuel-injected 4-cylinder and low miles, it generally would be a relatively reliable engine. You can obviously see the air conditioning compressor there, the airbox, and it's kind of standard K-car fare as you would expect, given that this was really a K-car platform. Now, interestingly, Chrysler would introduce its own 3.3-liter V6 engine that was optional in these minivans in 1990, but it only made 150 horsepower. So the turbocharged 4-cylinder engine at 150 horsepower was really the most powerful engine that you could get in these first-generation minivans. The first-generation minivan ended in 1990. I will say that one thing you want to be on the lookout for is that you don't want one of these Chrysler minivans that has the Ultra Drive transmission. That came into these vehicles in 1989, and that was a transmission that often had a significant amount of problems. The limp home mode, where it gets stuck in second gear. You're better off having the manual transmission like this one, or the Chrysler TorqueFlite 3-speed automatic. So you kind of want a 1987 or 88 model if you're just going to get a standard fare minivan, because then you get the 2.5-liter 4-cylinder that's fuel-injected as standard. Like I said, a pretty good engine. The Mitsubishi V6 wasn't all that great. And there you have the story of this awesome Dodge Caravan Turbo. I would love to have a minivan like this. I wish they kind of made hot minivans anymore, but well, they don't, and the minivan class has just been something that I think is starting to slip away gradually with each year. Like I said, it kind of got branded with the soccer mom moniker in the 2000s, and ever since that point, it really just started declining in popularity, which is unfortunate because minivans generally are quiet, comfortable, space-efficient, fuel-efficient. I just wish that they made some that were fun to drive or more rewarding to drive. But, oh well, such is life. Thanks again for watching.